Welcome to another episode of the Make Mental Health Matter show. I am your host, Kelli Melissa Reinhardt, and with every episode, I feel like I am excited for my guest. And as always, really just trying to get more information to you as a listener or a viewer and really showcase people resources because in today's society, I feel like we have enough resources. We just don't always know that they exist. And so when I am able to bring people on this show, more specifically guests who are either advocates of mental health, those with lived experience, or those that want to share their expertise and their journey throughout life. And if you've noticed, most people that I have on the show have a reason why they do what they do, which I think is even more special as we showcase people resources. So, without me babbling even further, let me introduce my guest for today. So, Beatty Carmichael is a mental health breakthrough expert and author of The Prayer of Freedom, a how-to guide that reveals the spiritual roots behind many mental and emotional struggles. With years of experience in spiritual healing, he's helped nearly 1,000 people find freedom from depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, PTSD, addiction, and more, often within 24 hours. His process is rooted in the science of spiritual law, not religion, and has a documented 90% success rate. Beatty's work bridges the gap between spiritual truths and psychology, offering a practical step-by-step approach that works regardless of one's beliefs. He's been featured on over 70 TV, podcast, and radio stations and is passionate about giving people real hope and proven solutions for healing. So, without bring us both up here, Beatty, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I'm very excited about being here.
Yeah, did I pronounce your name properly? Hopefully.
Absolutely perfect.
Okay. I'm
I love
like,
it.
sometimes I change it up and I'm like, I don't know which way. But so I know I just read your bio. However, can you just share with the audience a little bit more about your story, your journey, and what led you to this understanding that you have now?
So it's a long story, but to try to make it short, I actually come from a line of 7 generations of medical doctors, so almost 200 years. And rather than going into business, rather than going in medicine, I went into business. But about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, God called me back into healing, like my generations before me. And what's really interesting, Kelly, is back before medical science became purely science and agnostic spiritually, it used to be that when you would diagnose someone as a doctor, you recognized that healthcare was in 3 areas. It was mental, physical, and spiritual. And a lot of doctors were very good at hitting the right problem. But then, over the last 20 or 30 years, it seems like the medical science has let go of the spiritual side and is now mental or physical. And I think what we're seeing with all of this, and this is kind of how I got here, is you start looking at the misdiagnosed sources of issues. So it's easy to diagnose someone with anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder or PTSD. But the question is, how did it get there? And what we've seen at the same time the medical community has abandoned the spiritual side of analysis. We've seen the same period of time a dramatic increase, 70% increase in people being on psychiatric drugs over the last 20 years. Right now, the studies indicate about 66 million Americans are on psychiatric drugs. And the question is, they're not getting better. So what's going on? And as I started to go down this path, I started to using just a spiritual approach of identifying things that may have been happening in the spiritual side of a person's life not in a mystical sense, but just in a very practical sense. Like, for example, unforgiveness is a spiritual issue, it's not a mental issue. And by addressing just some of these spiritual things, I started to see people lose and get free of all of their symptoms of whatever the chronic situation was, whether it was like arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis, or knee pain, or migraines, or, as you mentioned, anxiety and bipolar disorder and things of that sort. So as I started to go that direction, I would take this newfound knowledge and excitement of actually bringing healing to people. And on weekends, I would go out to Walmart, just walk up to people at random saying, hey, can I pray for you on anything? And I found this one, I call it a target-rich environment, where most of the people there, they were dealing with a lot of issues in their life. It was actually the low-income part of Birmingham. Not to say that low income is the only place where this occurs, but a lot of times if you have people with mental health issues and addiction issues, you also find that they're probably in that lower income because they can't maintain higher income positions. And I started to see so many people set free, and a group of people I kept running into were all part of this Women's Addiction Recovery Center. It's one of the largest ones in America, I found out. They house 500 women. And they were so impressed that I would go out and try to help people, and that it was actually about 90% of the people were seeing instant results with it, that they asked me to come teach. I've been teaching there as a volunteer now for a number of years, and just setting those people free from their addictions, their mental health issues, their chronic pain, and treating it all as a spiritual symptom first, and seeing 90% of them disappear. So that's kind of a real short synopsis of how I got here.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. And I mean, it's just fascinating. I know we were talking off camera before we went live. And I think what you do is really fascinating because, yes, like you said, is that spiritual used to be a really big part. And I know with what I've been learning with neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP,
Yep.
we talk a lot about that spiritual aspect or the higher consciousness, right? Which is something that we don't necessarily in medicine anymore. So I love that you've found ways to incorporate all of these things, even with the line of all of the doctors in your family. So that's just fascinating.
Well, it's really interesting because, my dad, he retired from surgery at 70. He just turned 90, so that was 20 years ago. His older brother is still alive. He's also a physician, retired. And they are some of the most fascinated with this because they've seen in medicine that there are things that the medical community says is incurable. I remember years back, I was guiding someone through this process. And it was actually interesting. I was guiding this woman. I walked up at Walmart, and she had on a white blouse, but she had on a black compression sleeve. And I knew enough to know that that means there's pain, arthritis, or something. So I said, can I pray with you on that? Are you in pain? She said, yes, don't touch it. So, okay. Let me just guide your husband, right? So I guided the husband through this non-religious prayer to handle whatever may be spiritual oppressors on this. And all of the pain instantly left. And I didn't think anything of it because I don't know what RSD is. So I go back to my dad, and I was telling him some stories, like this lady she was diagnosed with degenerative discs in her neck and her back, and now she has full mobility. He said, that's pretty cool. Someone else that was taking opioids for all of his pain, and the pain left. That's very cool. And then I said, and what is RSD? Because I was praying for this person with RSD, and it instantly left. He said, if that happened, that was a miracle. I mean, like that one stood out. And he was saying that RSD is a neurological disease that is incurable. And the only thing you can do, it's very painful, the only thing you can do is take prescription meds for the pain. And what I'm finding is that these things that the medical community says is an incurable issue, I see it disappear at about 90% of the time because it wasn't a disease to begin with. It was a spiritual issue with a spiritual oppressor that's manifesting into our physical life as what a doctor would diagnose as a disease, because it may look the same. The way I like to explain it, Kelly, is my son actually has an old Acura outside. If I were to take a Ferrari body and stick it on top of that Acura, you and everyone else might say, that's a Ferrari. I say, no, just go look under the hood. You look under the hood, oh, no, that's not a Ferrari, right? It's an Acura masquerading as a Ferrari. And I think a lot of times what we're dealing with is a spiritual oppressor of some sort that's masquerading as PTSD, anxiety, addiction, suicide thoughts, chronic pain, rheumatoid arthritis. And they're very good at masquerading it, but when you apply the spiritual approach, most of the time they disappear, and it shows that it wasn't that disease, it was actually something else.
Interesting. And I guess the questions that kind of pop into my head. So for those people that maybe aren't very spiritual, or I know it's not always necessarily religion, right? Like we
Right.
talk about source, universe, God, right? They're all kind of interchangeable depending on your belief. But there is a spiritual aspect, which I know for myself. So I was born and raised Mormon, was very religious growing up, and then kind of made this shift of like, I don't want anything to do with it, right? And then learning more about neurolinguistic programming, the conscious, the unconscious, the higher consciousness, and really bringing in those spiritual aspects back into my life, and not necessarily having to attach them to a religion. I am understanding that it is important to have that spiritual aspect in your life. So those people that are like, what in the heck are you even talking about? I don't understand. How could we best explain to them the spiritual concept?
That's a really great question, and I have a really good answer, I hope. So think about this. A lot of times, some people may be more atheistic than simply agnostic. Agnostic says, I recognize a spiritual side of things and maybe a higher conscience, but I don't know what name, and I don't believe a certain belief. I just recognize its existence. Atheism says there is no existence out there. But what we find is there are things that we can't comprehend as a purely physical person, physical being. How come I can do something that I've never been told was wrong, but when I do it, I feel guilty? I feel like I just did something wrong. And how is it that when I do something really good, I feel elated like I did something right? And what I have found is this higher conscience, higher power, God, whatever name you want to use it. My terminology is God, because I kind of grew up in a church. I separated there because it was like you, very legalistic and very religious to a degree. And so I still use the terminology God, but it's all the same. And what I've learned, Kelly, is that the spiritual side of us, there's some creator that created us, and he has a standard of right and wrong, good and bad. And so he builds into each of us, in our spiritual side of our being, a conscience that directs us on right and wrong, good and bad. Otherwise, we would just be chaos everywhere. So this brings some moral code that's been embedded into us already to help us live within peace and harmony with others. And when we violate it, we usually know that we violated it. So that's the expression of how do you determine what part of you may be spiritual, and does it exist? But the other thing that's really interesting, and this is cool. So I have a scientific mind, very much like my ancestors. And I wanted to show a simple demonstration of how to prove scientifically something that you cannot see or grasp. And I have my pen, and I'm going to let go of my pen, and when I do, it drops into my palm. Every time I pick up the pen and let go of it, it drops into my palm. If you did the same thing on your end, the same thing would happen. So now, using a scientific method called empirical data that we can observe, we can see that if I do the same activity as you do the same activity, and we both get the same result, then there must be a law that governs that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I started to do with the prayer of freedom, I labeled it the prayer of freedom because it just so consistently works. It's a step-by-step guide to freedom that as I started to understand these laws and started to see them in practice, I began creating a step-by-step process that people would go through to basically, the very simple answer is say to this creator consciousness out there in the universe that says, I confess I did wrong. I violated that standard. And when we do that, then the issues going on in our life start to vanish and disappear. And I've seen this. I was doing a show with a guy who had some issue at age 14. He's 41 now, so that's 26 years, 25 years, whatever it was. And he was dealing with anxiety and depression for the last 26 years. On a scale of 0 to 10, they were an 8. So to demonstrate, I literally led him on the show through this process. And he's going, it's going down, it's going down, it's at a 3 now, it's gone. I mean, he felt it literally go out. I was asking him, when was the last time you had 0 anxiety or depression? He said it's been 26 years. And yet, right there on their show, by handling it as this spiritual issue, and I think all he did was forgave his mom. Maybe something else, but it was something like that, because the thing that happened at age 14 dealt with his mom. And so by doing that, this spiritual oppressor that was diagnosed as anxiety and depression went away, which shows that it wasn't mental or chemical. It was spiritual. And that's what's been so cool. And so where I'm going on this is taking people through this process. It works whether they believe in a higher power, whether they are spiritual or not, because it's not based on one's belief. It's simply based on tapping those laws.
I love, okay, so I'm like, my brain's like going in a bunch of ways. But the reason, because as most people know that have been watching my show, I lost my middle sister who died by suicide in 2017. And one of the biggest things that changed my whole entire life and being and all the things that got me into doing my nonprofit now was because I forgave her and then I forgave myself, which was something that I had no clue that I needed, because I held on to what now I call the hoodoo voodoo, shoulda, coulda, wouldas. I was like, what could I have done? What should I have done? How could I have helped, right? Like that was just playing over and over and over in my head, but also really this like fear of losing anybody else in my life. And when I was able to just like get in there and forgive her and forgive me, that was huge in my life. So yeah, I
so
feel
what that hugeness, that weight that was lifted off, that peace that came in, and by the way, we've never talked about it, but I know that weight was lifted off and peace and calm came in, because all of these are spiritual. And every time, so by the way, there are 18 different categories I've identified in where we violate God's standards. And that's what my Prayer Freedom book does, is it guides you through just almost like a memory jogger. Have I violated this standard here? Have I done this? And the number one category is unforgiveness, because it impacts probably 60 or 70% of all the issues most people go through. Can I share some stories of how unforgiveness and simply forgiving someone, how it manifests in various ways? This is really cool, because we're talking about how does the spiritual impact the physical, that the doctors diagnose the physical as a correct symptom, but a wrong source. How do you know when you've been when the doctors got the wrong source? Because whatever therapy they apply doesn't solve the problem. Right? In fact, this is medical science, straight down the line. My father-in-law, when he was living, he was an internist, and he would always preach, health is mental, physical, and spiritual, right? And so he would say, okay, so you have this diagnosis, you have a cough. I think it's pneumonia. Let's treat it for pneumonia. So you treat pneumonia and nope, that's not it. So let's go back, let's look at it deeper. Well, maybe it's an allergy. So you treat it as an allergy. And until you find the therapy that works, you really don't know what the source is, even though you could diagnose the symptom. So watch this. I was out at Walmart, my wife and I, and we like to just, back in our target-rich environment, a lot of homeless people. So there was this couple there, Brandon and Lanita, and we prayed for them. They just had something, and they were getting an apartment. So we said, come on in, let us help you buy a few things to get an apartment set up, some linens and some cookware type stuff. And I bought a book for them on spiritual growth. It's about the size of my book, The Prayer of Freedom. And Lanita was carrying it down the aisle, and I was teasing with Brandon. I said, you're going to have to steal that book from Lanita if you want to read it. And she says, oh no, Brandon will read it to me because I can't read. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Have you never learned to read? She said, no, I know how to read, but I can't see to read. Everything is blurry. And to demonstrate, she actually could not read the book until she pulled it up about 3 or 4 inches from her eyes. And I said, well, God doesn't want you to have bad vision. Can I guide you in prayer with it? She said, yes. And the first thing I said, do you have unforgiveness for anyone? She said, yes. I said, who is it? She said, it was my ex-boyfriend. He grabbed me by the back of the hair and pounded my face over and over again against the side of the dresser and bust out all my teeth. So imagine the trauma. She showed me her teeth. She had no teeth, top or bottom, on the front of her mouth. And I said, would you be willing to forgive him? Because that's a pretty difficult thing to forgive. She said yes. So I simply led her to say, God, I forgive Bill for what he did to me. And then we say, God, would you restore her eyesight? And literally within about 2 minutes, everything was perfectly clear. I opened up that book, and I held it about 3 or 4 feet away from her, and she could read it clearly. So that's eyesight. Then over at this addiction recovery center, a lady named Susan came up, and that day her rheumatoid arthritis had been really kind of getting bad, and she asked if I would guide her in prayer. So I said yes, and I asked her, do you have unforgiveness for anyone? She said yes. And by the way, I'm being prompted by the Creator to ask these questions. And I said, who is it? She said, it's my sister. She did something against my mom about 20 years ago, and I've never forgiven her. Now, she's had rheumatoid arthritis 15 or 20 years. You can start to see the correlation. And she's been diagnosed with this arthritis, okay? So I led her to say, God, I forgive my sister for what she did against my mom. Her rheumatoid arthritis pain immediately started to decrease. By the end of the hour, it was gone. She went back to the doctor 4 weeks later for a normal checkup. He retested her for arthritis and says, you have no arthritis in your body. Totally gone. What medical science says is incurable. It was a spiritual oppressor. On a show just recently, I was asking this lady if there was something that we could demonstrate. She says, yes, I have neuropathy in my legs, and it's really bad. I said, how long have you had it? I've had it 15 years, and it's always about an 8 on a 0 to 8 scale, 0 to 10 scale. So we had her ask God, is there something in my life that I've violated? And there was, and it turned out to be unforgiveness towards someone. And as soon as she forgave that person, her neuropathy literally instantly left. She started to tear up, and she was trying to hold back tears because her mascara wasn't waterproof. And then someone else, she is helping a friend in the kitchen, and the friend said, hey, can you cut this orange for me? Oh, no, I can't, because if I touch it, I break out because I'm allergic to it. So she rightly said, do you have unforgiveness for anyone? And by forgiving someone, she can now touch the oranges and the fruits, and all of that disappeared. So whether it's blinded eyes, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, neuropathy, allergies, okay, things of that sort, it's all the same root, but it's manifesting in different ways that doctors diagnose a different symptom, but the root is always the same. They masquerade as all kinds of things. These tormenting, I call them tormenting energy sources. They'll masquerade as all kinds of things, but they have the same root, which is a spiritual issue, not a physical or chemical issue.
So fascinating. And I have some thoughts that popped into my head, but we have to go to our first sponsored break. And then once we get back, I will share what I was thinking. So we'll be right
Perfect.
back after this.
Have you ever felt completely alone?
Like your life doesn't matter.
One person dies due to suicide every 40 seconds. Have you ever felt completely alone?
Like your life doesn't matter.
One person dies due to suicide every 40 seconds.
You are not alone. Call the National Suicide Lifeline at 988.
Hope and recovery is possible.
1 in 8 people globally live with a mental disorder.
That's why empowering minds saves lives.
We need your help.
With only $19 a month, you help us save lives through mental health and suicide prevention education.
Scan the QR code or go to makementalhealthmatter.org to sign up as a warrior for mental health today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kimberly L. Wilson, also known as Dr. Burnout. You can catch me on Leadership Beyond Burnout on E360 TV on Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Vitality Network, where we focus on emerging women leaders and women leaders.
And like that, we're back. I want to just talk a little bit. So I want to show the commercial that we did for you also here in just a moment. But I think what you do is so fascinating. And I know also the power of our brain, right? Like, I don't think we talk enough about how powerful our brains are and how the mind and the body are connected, therefore they affect each other. And when we're holding on to all of these things throughout life, whether it is unforgiveness or there's a childhood trauma or and I talk a lot about how trauma is very different for everybody, right? Like, everybody's experience is very different. So I could stub my toe and that could be a trauma for me. However, I have done it so many times that it's not so traumatic for me anymore, you know? So it's like these things throughout our life, and then, as you said, it manifests into our body, which we don't talk about it, which is that spiritual aspect, right? Is like, how do we understand that there are things that happen to us, around us, within us, that affect us as we go throughout life. And when we can pinpoint that part of whatever it is, whether it is that unforgiveness or it is any of those other things, right? The cool part that I love is you talk about it more in like the scientific way also, of knowing line of doctors that it's, hey, the DSM tells me this based off of this symptom, right? And I'm going to give you this pill based off of this. Oh, wait, it's not that. So let's treat this instead of that, right? So being able to uncover those things and move people through those moments with prayer, I think it's just so powerful.
Well, let me share something, because I love the first commercial was on suicide, and to illustrate how sometimes simple these very complex things happen. I was listening to a man speak who does very similar work as I do, and he was walking out of the door with this older couple, good friends of his, and he said, "Hey, how are you guys doing?" And the wife said, "We're okay." And he knew something was wrong, so he just kind of put his hand around her shoulder and said, and as soon as he did, it was like the creator, this higher consciousness, placed a thought in his head. And he said, "Do you have thoughts of suicide?" And she broke down in tears, and she said, "Yes, for 6 months, and I can't stop it." And so, understanding how these spiritual laws work, he then asked her, did anything happen 6 months ago where you said anything along the lines of, I could just die? Or I wish I was dead, or anything like that? Because what happens is there is a spiritual realm, and there are these energy sources, or you call them spirits, or whatever the terminology, but they all focus on the same thing, that are there to, sometimes they're just to bring harm to us. And she said, yes. She said, my grandson died 6 months ago. And I said, I could just die. And at that moment, that's when she started having these thoughts, almost like voices in her head, every day, strong, kill yourself. You need to just kill yourself. And it was all she could do to resist it. So he led her to renounce that comment that she made. I renounce God, Creator. I renounce my comment of I could just die, because that's violating his standards, right? And the voices stopped. All the suicidal thoughts stopped. And so a lot of times what happens is in our highly scientific world, we think everything can be boiled down to either a chemical in the body or mental, some such and such, and maybe just the tough it up and drive hard discipline, and you can overcome anything mentally. But there's actually something more going on that we've lost sight of, and that's that spirituality part, and understanding how the laws on the spirituality side work and how to quickly undo them. And that's what, just like with her, and just like with, I mentioned this comment, but studies show that probably 66 million Americans are on psychiatric meds. Watch this. Literally, now when you're working at an addiction recovery center, almost every single one of those ladies at the center are dealing with mental health issues, voices in their head, heaviness, anxiety, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, panic attacks, depression. And 90% of them, when they go through this process, literally, I simply give them my book. There's a worksheet in the back, a step-by-step worksheet on how to do this. And I don't go through it with them. I simply give them the time and space to do it on their own. And literally about 90% of them, all of their mental health issues completely disappear because they were spiritual in root and not chemical. And so when you can affect that, and if that number could be extrapolated out to those 66 million Americans, that means that that's possible as many as 60 million of those Americans could have been diagnosed correctly on the symptom, but wrong on the source, and they're being overdrugged needlessly because the drugs aren't doing anything other than creating more problems. You get on this drug, now you got, a friend of mine was on ADHD medicine. Well, that created depression, so now they put him on depression medicine. That creates sleep problems, so they put him on sleep. And now he's drugged up. Today he's off, I think, all of that, and his life is clear. He can think. He doesn't have depression. All these things that were the side effects of trying to solve the wrong problem with the drug, and it creates another problem and another problem, and you can get free of it. Now, he's doing it with the psychiatrist. She's the one pulling it off, but she can tell you no longer need this. And so she's taking him off these things, and it's been life-changing for him.
Yeah, I actually, so multiple of my previous guests, we've had these conversations about, because I also have many people in my space who have been diagnosed with BPD, bipolar, one that was actually misdiagnosed as bipolar, again, put on medication, which caused this issue, put on a medication, which caused this issue, to put on that medication, right? So, and then they realized that all of that was not actually what her diagnosis was. It actually was more BPD, but the one thing that I think is so interesting, and what I understand about mental health and diagnosis, and especially BPD, is that they say that it is not one of those that will ever go away, right? And it's also a combination of a whole bunch of different diagnosis. I like to call them challenges, because I feel like you can move through them versus, always having to be on them. But It's a very interesting, and I've also had other guests in the past that have said that their BPD went away as they made these life changes, and that's what you're talking about is
Yeah.
when we can find the root cause, like what is that? Is it a spiritual aspect? Is it right? Like how do we move you through what is that thing that can ultimately get you to this better place of life? So yeah, it's definitely, I'm like, you probably watched all the other episodes because we had so many guests that we've had these conversations with too.
But let me share something since you're mentioning BPD. Uh, uh, the sorry, yeah. One of my students, and it's in my book. Her name is Ashlyn, and she was her story was she was raped at 6 and 7 years old by her uncle and her dad. And as you can imagine, that takes you spiraling down. By age 14 or 12 or somewhere in there, she was officially diagnosed with anxiety, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, depression. She was put on all kinds of meds. I don't know if I can use med names on this or not. Should I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So by the time she came to this addiction recovery center, she was on 400 milligrams a day of Seroquel just to calm her nerves. 200 in the morning, 200 at night. Now I'm not a psychiatrist, but I understand that's like really, really high. She was on Zoloft. She was on Buspirone. She had two daughters, 1 and 3 years old, and they had already been diagnosed with asthma and taken inhalers at that early age. And this is something interesting about the spiritual side of things. Sometimes when we have a spiritual root, it impacts our loved ones, our children. So she went through this process, going through this guide in the back of my book, and went through the prayer portion that simply turns off the spiritual roots. And she said the very next morning, because all this happened in one day, the very next morning she says, I woke up and I was totally fine. I had no fear. I had no depression. She said, I went to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, well, if you don't need the meds, just don't take them. And so she hadn't taken them since. It was like it all turned off. That's been months ago. The other thing she noticed is that her 1 and 3 year old no longer asked for their inhalers. All their asthma disappeared. They're now running hard like all the kids, jumping up and down and doing everything they could never have done with asthma. And it's like that whatever she did in turning off these different categories where she had violated this Creator's standards in our conscience, it also impacted what was going on with her children. But it was instantaneous. And a lot of times we can deal with these things over time and come to the same process by our neurological processes. But what I'm finding with the prayer freedom is it goes so quickly to the source that frequently this is, in fact, almost all cases, it's overnight. The things I'm seeing that happen quickly, mental illness related stuff, the symptoms go almost instantly, within an hour or two, or sometimes overnight. ADHD took longer. There's something more there, so it's been taking probably several months. Sleep apnea, probably a week. Diabetes type 2 with one person took 5 months. But most of the chronic things that are just chronic pain, chronic mental type of struggles that we go through, all of those seem to go fairly quickly. Blurry eyesight, if it's tied to this, it goes almost instantly. So it's really interesting to understand, see what goes on and how quickly it happens. But most of it is really, really fast. And that's been, especially from the medical side with my family, they go, really? It happened just like that? I said, yeah. We're standing there in the aisle and poof, it's like gone. So it's really been a lot of fun.
That is really cool. And I have another thought that popped into my head as far as the ADHD. But we have to go to our quick last sponsored break. And then once we get back, I'll share what I was thinking. So we'll be right back after this.
Anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, chronic pain. For many, these struggles feel permanent, especially when therapy and medication fall short. But what if the real issue isn't emotional or chemical, but spiritual? Beatty Carmichael has uncovered a science-based approach to prayer that targets the spiritual roots behind mental health and other issues. And when those roots are removed, the torment disappears. It's called the Prayer of Freedom, and it's helping thousands find real healing from anxiety, chronic pain, addiction, trauma, and more. With a 90% success rate, many find breakthrough in just days. Discover what's possible. Visit theprayeroffreedombook.com.
1,917 people die daily from suicide globally.
I lost my middle sister, Carrie, to a completed suicide on February 20th, 2017.
How does Kelli, host of the Make Mental Health Matter show, impact lives?
Number 1. Awareness.
My story, however, it isn't unique. I am a domestic violence survivor and a recovering addict. For 14 years, I was in active addiction. And because of Kelli and the work that she does and the opportunity to have my voice heard, I was able to stay clean and sober and have hit a year. I'm still here. And if it wasn't for Kelli answering my call the day that I thought I was going to take my life.
2. Conversation.
I'm curious, and I know that I've heard a lot in the BIPOC community. It is very hush-hush. It's like one of those things that you don't talk about. Like, you literally feel like it's not a conversation you can have. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
First, shout out to Kelli, because I'm glad that she asked the question. I researched you before I went on your show, and I saw how real and authentic you were. And I just appreciate the question, because it is different and we have to have tough, courageous conversations. So yes, I always say I'm a triple diversity threat. I'm a Black woman with multiple disabilities. Now, I'm not really a threat, but to other people, I may be, because people fear the unknown and what they're uncomfortable with.
Number 3. Education.
Kelli's passionate commitment to mental health awareness is a beautiful thing. It's clear in her social media posts, it's clear in the resources that she puts together, in the activities that she provides, her collaboration with organizations, and the consistent way that she continues to deliver a message, encouraging people to understand that they can share openly and to break the stigma around mental health. Kelli's topics cover children and adults, talk about things that we can do as a community, things that we can do individually, and her website is packed with information and resources and all kinds of contacts that you can use to reach out, whether you're dealing with something yourself or you're looking to help somebody else who is struggling. I encourage you to check it out.
Like that, we're back again. So if you happen to be just tuning into the Make Mental Health Matter show, thank you so much for watching or listening. You've missed the whole beginning, so make sure you go back and listen, because fascinating, really talking about the spiritual aspects of mental health and being able to pinpoint or figure out what's going on, and knowing that these things can shift very, very quickly. Before we went to the break, so ADHD is something that I've never been diagnosed. However, I have 20 million tabs open all the time. And I had a friend more recently say to me, she's like, well, who told you that you had ADHD? And I was like, nobody ever told me, but over time I've had friends that are like, oh, well, have you ever gotten tested? You should go get tested, blah, 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 blah. And she said to me, which was really, really interesting, and I had to process what she said, but she's like, would you like to remove the belief that you have ADHD, or the word that you're associating to ADHD with yourself? And I was like, that's interesting to think that way. So you mentioned ADHD, and I know that many people that surround me, including my son. However, he's 10, and I also believe that he's 10. So boys, they have energy. But as we get older, I know both my mom and my sister were late set diagnosed with ADHD. So Interesting.
It is. And it's also interesting, you're talking about it could be, your mindset. So here's what's interesting. One of the big things, and this is actually one of the 18 categories in this. Now keep in mind, I'm working in addiction recovery, and most of these ladies have been addicts for decades. Many of them are there by court order. They still have their ankle bracelets on. And so like addiction, it comes from the three main sources of addiction is, number one, abandonment as a child, rejection, and so it kind of pushes you in the wrong direction and you look for love in all the wrong areas, so to speak. Number two, there is something spiritually that happens. I call it in the bloodline. The blood is the life of who we are, and so in our blood. And you see this. It's interesting. I'll have the ladies raise their hands, and 90% their parents or grandparents have been suffering with the same issues as they have. But the third one is your thinking, and I call it. These are my terms, but I call it a word curse because it's a word that we believe and that we confess that then becomes a curse into our life. And one of the biggest issues is when if we were to peel back, and we don't have time to peel this back, but I share it in my book, peel back what's actually happening within the spiritual realm. There are these spiritual entities that are separate from us, but they attach to us when we break this conscience. And one of those, they come in and attach to us when we have a wrong thinking. It's like when I say, hi, I'm Beatty Carmichael and I am an alcoholic. I have just made the statement that I believe I am an alcoholic. And as long as I believe it, it's not a mindset thing as much as it is a spiritual thing that comes in and fulfills that commitment in my mind. So when I believe something, I actually had this happen to me. This is funny. So I think I'm a little bit older than you, but when I turned 50, that was a few years back, I thought, oh, I'm getting old. So when I would bend down like an old man, very stiff, and I need to watch my walk so I don't trip. And, I started doing all these old man things because I actually thought at 50, I'm now old. And then I remember a year or two after, I saw some guy in his 60s or something, spry and nimble and acting young, and I said, maybe I don't have to be old. So I literally changed my mind, and now I just bend down and pick up things like I was a lot younger. It's a total shift, and that's the power of your mind. But there is a spiritual part that ties into, especially as it deals with the things that the medical science will diagnose as disease. There could be that thing that you're talking about is simply you believe it to be true enough that you actually attract that energy source that manifests it in your life.
And we're talking like the same. So my brain, when you're talking, it goes into like the brain. So like the science behind the brain, right? And I know that there is also, so in my words is like that higher consciousness, like
yes, that's it,
right? But yes, the spiritual aspect, which is all, it's all the same thing. But it is so fascinating because I also talk a lot about is the words that we use with ourselves and with others, and also how we say things. So if I say that I am ADHD, then I'm identifying with that, which is exactly what you said. Or I say I live with or experience ADHD, right? Like it's very different, and I don't have to be that identity, which is, I didn't understand any of this obviously until I like really got into the brain and mental health and lots of certifications and education. But it is very powerful what we say about ourselves because it attaches to that belief. And when we can start to shift those aspects in our life, it does. And I was one of those people that I'm like, this doesn't work. What are you talking about? And then I had that moment literally after when I was talking about how I forgave my sister and forgave myself. I had that moment of this isn't going to work. And I went home that night and I was like, interesting, right? So it's so powerful how quickly we can shift when we, whether it is through prayer or it is through changing our words or it's through identifying what is that root cause and moving through. And sometimes it takes a moment, like you said, sometimes it takes a couple months. But the
Yes,
part I think about what you said is that it doesn't have to be for the rest of our lives, right? We
that's the key.
can truly shift.
So I have a friend that's dealing with a lot of depression, and I don't think it's a spiritual issue. I think it's a neurological track. You know, when you keep going down this one neurological track, you'll build this track in your mind, and you become like that because that's all your thoughts can't get out of it. And so sometimes you have to just force yourself to no longer go down that track, saying I am depressed, and start to confess something different. What's interesting is a lot of times I'm seeing so much connectivity, that's the wrong word, but intersection between the science of the mind, especially on our thought process, and the spiritual side of it, that I'm not sure which one, how to discern one from the other because they're very similar. They go down almost like parallel paths. But I love what you're saying because I'm in total agreement with it. And a lot of times the mental health struggles we go through, they start with our thoughts. But then what I'm finding is on some of them, like take anxiety. You know, usually you have trauma or PTSD, which is, you know, all this magnified. And now there's something that keeps you totally in fear the whole time and anxious. And I've seen it literally turn off instantly within minutes by handling it as this. I've also seen the same thing turn off over time by addressing it through psychotherapy. You go back to the root and you can address it and you can start to calm down. So it's almost like both of them are hitting the same spot, but when you can turn it off instantly through the prayer freedom process, then it indicates that it's probably much more spiritual than simply something in our thought life. And that's the thing that's been fascinating me, saying it's like, wow. I mean, if I believed in miracles, I kind of do, but I would be saying this is miraculous because it's so instantaneous, not for everyone, but for those that it's effective with. It's like, I mean, it changes their lives overnight.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I could literally talk about this for hours upon hours, but that's because I've also had those experiences too. And even going back, a lot of people know my story that have been listening or watching this, but I know for me, after my sister passed, there was a lot of fear in my life, and that's what I was holding on to. And it was the fear of losing anybody else, fear of everything in my life at that point. And that's what I found. It was that fear. And what I was able to do through a process, it was a neurolinguistic programming process, which is probably a lot of like what you do with the prayer. Is it's a guided process that
Yes.
ultimately I changed fear into curiosity. And that was, again, huge for my life. And it shifted so quickly. And that was the moment that I was like, oh my gosh, if this works for me, I got to figure this out. So, but I know we're coming to the end and I love what you're doing. I will definitely have to get one of your books just to see how it is different. And I love the fact that people can grab it. It is tangible. They can walk through this themselves. It's not something that they say have to come to me to do sessions like NLP, although that's always a possibility, or come to you and do that. It's something tangible that they can help themselves, but also they could come to you if they want to. So please share with the audience how they can find you, what is the best place to follow you, and grab your book.
Perfect. The best place on all of that starts at the book website called the prayeroffreedombook.com. This is the best place to go. Good job. This is the place to go because prayer and freedom are such big keywords that you'll lose the book if you just search for it yourself. But there's a link straight to Amazon from there. There's also some free information. There's a video and some testimonials that you can see what it's done in other people's lives. So the prayeroffreedombook.com. And then you can always reach out to me personally at my website, BeattyCarmichael.com.
Amazing. And so those of you that are listening, it's the THE prayer, PRAYER of freedom, FREEDOM.com. Or you can go directly, and Beatty is BEATTY Carmichael, CARMICHAEL.com, you said?
Yes.
Perfect. So, no matter what you do, make sure you go check it out. And I mean, thank you for bringing what you do. I truly believe that the conversation needs to be had, especially incorporating spiritual back into the medical practice. And I love that you have found this way to really showcase to just everyday humans to be able to help themselves. They don't have to just be that diagnosis. It doesn't have to be the end all be all. I don't know if that's the right phrase.
Yep,
but
that's it.
Thank you so much for being amazing guests. I really, really appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I've really been pleased to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, y'all, that was another amazing episode of the Make Mental Health Matters show. I hope you got some information out of this. Again, make sure I'm gonna pop it back up here. I know if you're listening, it's the prayeroffreedom.com. Make sure you go check that out. If you are at all curious what we're talking about as far as spiritual, yes, there are medical, right? Like, we're not saying to change what you're doing, but if you're curious and you want to find other ways to help yourself or help others that are around you, it really truly can shift pretty quickly. Our brains are really, really powerful. And when we're able to just find that root cause, we can literally transform our lives. So no matter what you do, make sure you come back next week. I go live every single Monday it's at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. Mountain Time, or you can watch on E360 TV at 5 p.m. I'll see you next week. Bye, y'all.